Pack Sack Rescue, November the 16th. Daylight caught me fed and with everything skinned other than the beaver, and it could wait till I got back from the north end of the lake. North wind was howling straight down the length of Hiawatha Lake, but with only 2 miles to travel I hardly even noticed it before I was standing over what used to be a hole in the ice. Cutting a big hole right above where my best guess of where my pack would be, I lowered the big fish hook, which was now tied to a rope, down into the water. Letting it hit the bottom, I dragged it as far as the hole would allow and snagged nothing but some stiff weedy plants. Okay, so I was going to need a really big hole. Chopping for a while, I tried again and again, with no luck. Back to chopping, and soon the hole was bigger than the one I'd fallen through. Hours went by and the biggest thing I brought up was a piece of driftwood. Then my brain kicked in and I headed to shore to cut a pole that was at least 12 feet long. Back at the hole, I used the pole to poke at the bottom of the lake and look for something that felt like a lump. Within minutes I had felt what could be the pack. It had a solid feeling, but was not hard like a rock. Marking the spot, I took the lure and tried to snag it. No luck again. After another half hour, I headed back to shore and cut a pole that had a strong branch near the bottom. Cutting the branch off at about 6 inches, I used it to try and snag the pack's straps. On my third attempt, I hooked onto something heavy. Pulling carefully, I was finally rewarded at the sight of my pack breaking through the surface. Grabbing the strap before it could slip back into water, I heaved it out onto the ice and sat back relieved. Honest to God, you thought I had just won the lottery. I was so happy. Leaving the traps, bait, and wire there to be picked up in the morning, I took the food and the pack to dry it out over the stove. Now the big question, did I have enough time to go and check the Pody Lake traps? Yeah, I did. On a rush though, I hurried out and stopped quick to check the point traps. The wolves, looked like 2 of them, had again stolen the bait from the mink set. Boy, these things were getting annoying. I would read bait on the way out tomorrow, but I really needed to get a move on. Lobo seemed comfortable at camp, so I told him to stay, and with a hot coffee and a few bites of bannock, I took off down the trail. With 2 marten and the same amount of squirrels, I returned home about an hour after dark. There just did not seem to be enough day out there anymore. Now I knew it would only get worse as we got closer to Christmas. My fur catch was starting to pile up nicely, and suddenly I could not estimate what I had caught. Taking a minute to get an accurate count, it ended up being 11 beaver, 14 marten, 7 mink, 10 rats, 2 otters, 12 squirrels, 1 wolf, and a weasel. Not a record catch, but I was happy with it considering the amount of work that had to get finished when I arrived here. Tomorrow was again going to be a big day. I trimmed down my load, leaving the food and bringing extra traps instead. The food that was at the camp on Emmabelle would have to do for the first trip. For now, with my nightly chores finished, I sipped on the last cup of Java and let the radio lull me to sleep. Tomorrow I was seeing new country again, and I couldn't wait. Are you kidding me? Finally, November 17th. Finally, I was again on my way to Amabel Lake. While I was enjoying my breakfast of oatmeal with bannock and honey, I dished out a helping of dog food for Lobo in case I used all the bait-making beaver or mink and marten sets. My pack had 90% dried out overnight, so with my gear loaded and my fur as mouse-proofed as it could be, I stepped out onto the trail. Hurrying across the narrows to throw a chunk of bait in my mink set, I then turned north up the lake and found a marten in my other mink set. Cool. But what to do with it? Take it with me or leave it? There was no way I was leaving it on the ground for the mice to find, so I decided to hang it in a tree with a piece of wire. With another nice big male in the middle trap between the lake and the Little Fraser River, I exchanged that trap and hung the filled one from a branch. Once at the river, I bypassed the 2 beaver traps to the west as I would check them on the return trip. Pulling all my rat and mink drown wire sets, I did catch 3 muskrats and 1 mink. And I noticed a weird looking lump on the top of a dead broken off tree. So I watched it as I got closer. Close enough, I guess, as a huge bird took wing and floated effortlessly over the grassy meadow. I'd never seen a great gray owl before, but I knew them from books, and this was a beauty. Obviously looking for a meal, and I wondered to myself if they were one of the reasons I had not seen a single marten track out in the open grassy areas. Would they eat marten? I didn't see why not. It drifted to the far side of the opening and I moved past him to get to my beaver traps. Picking more sets up on the way, I added another rat and a marten to the bag. The beaver sets were frozen in, with one having a huge beaver in it. The animal's back was sticking out of the ice a little bit, and the birds had been pecking at it. Damage was not too bad, but it would degrade the value for sure. But these traps were pulled now, since there was 2 beavers taken from this house. On the dam there were otter tracks that disappeared down and under the ice below the dam. Just past the pond there was another of the huge owls. The mate of the first one, possibly? I wondered, do they mate for life like eagles and Canada geese? All I knew for sure was that they were cool to watch, with their big round faces turning to watch me as I walked past them. Cutting through the bush in places where the river closed in, I would take notice, or I would notice marten tracks, but not really out in the open. It would be only mink and otter. The odd fox track was around as well, and I should make some sets, but just didn't seem to have the time. As I got closer to Otter Lake, I started looking for places to set wolf snares. At one spot, I blocked the trail with guide sticks to try and guide the wolves into my snare. And a short distance further, in a patch of thick tag alders, I placed another snare for them. Liking the set, I kept going and finally arrived at the lake. At Third Otter Lake, I put in 2 quick sets, having already been there, and I knew which sets I was going to make, so I cut the needed poles on the way. 1 entrance and 1 bait snare set were the ticket here. When I got to the river exit out of Otter Lake, I noticed that the river really was a river now. A lot more water flowing, with many small ponds joined by rapids. Made sure that for the next mile there was no chance of using a canoe in the future years if I ever got the notion. In the second pond I found another live house, so I threw in a snare bait set between the feed bed and the dam. Down rivers a ways I crossed to the north side of the river to get away from some rocky cliffs, and as my trail was running between the river and a steep hill, I came across a fallen tree. This thing must have been 4 or 5 feet wide at the base and a good 3 feet thick where I crawled over. From the fallen tree I left the creek and headed straight east. The river had taken a turn to the south, so I blazed a trail down the gentle slope, and after a short 200 yards, Amabel Lake opened up to me. Not sure where the cabin was located, I had 2 options. I was about 1/3 of the way up the lake from the south shore. That gave me a 2 out of 3 chance that the cabin was to the north. So that was the way I went. North, up the western shore, and in less than a mile I'd spotted the camp on a small point sticking out into the lake. The lonely plywood structure stood out as the only sign of man that I had seen for some time. Standing beside the snow-covered dock, I looked down at Lobo. He seemed to be thinking the same thing I was. It ain't a mansion, but it's still nicer than sleeping in a hole in the ground. Climbing the slight rise from the shore, I noticed a lump in the snow and turned out to be 2 boats flipped over and leaning one on the other. The weathered plywood over frame construct had a small deck attached and a couple of windows on the east and south walls. A stovepipe sticking through the tar paper covered roof assured me that I would at least have some heat for the night. A small shed and an outhouse were the only other buildings on this site. Checking the shed, I found nothing but a buck saw and some tin cans with nails in them. Moving on to the cabin itself, I didn't feel the need to check the outhouse. I tried the door and thankfully it was not locked. I've since learned that most camps in the wilderness are left unlocked on the off chance that someone might need to make use of them in an emergency. Besides, locks only keep honest people out. Once inside, I saw 2 rows of bunk beds along the north and west walls, and with a mattress for each bed leaning against the wall. Not a blanket in sight, but of course why would there be? If they were left here, the mice would be destroying them. Well, this was a pickle. My first order of business was to check on my food supply. It didn't take me long to take stock of what was here. A quarter of a jar of jam and even less of peanut butter with a box that was half full of pancake mix. A tiny jar of instant coffee and a little sugar rounded out my supply. Well, thank God for the coffee at least. There was that food. Where was the food supply that the game wardens had said would be there? Oh well, better than nothing, I guess. Beggars can't be choosers. But it didn't look like I would be staying here for 2 nights now. With some daylight left, I decided to explore the rest of the lake and see what was up with the beavers. Now I wished I had brought my gun. I could already have shot at least 1 grouse today. On the west shore, right around the point from the cabin, I found a nice lodge. Looking up towards the north end of the lake, I saw a black dot on the ice by the river's mouth. Moving closer, I looked again and it was gone. There it was again, and gone. An otter was catching his food and eating it on the ice. The river mouth was wide open and there were a lot of tracks all over the snow. This was where the Fraser River started to build in size as it flowed north to join with the Kenegami River and eventually the Albany Rivers. The day was winding down and I needed to get to the cabin and eat some supper. I would explore a little ways upstream towards East Amabel in the morning. It was, according to the map, less than 2 miles to the lake, and I would be able to cover that and be back in an hour or so. At least I would know how many beaver traps I needed to bring on the next trip. 20 minutes later, I was in camp and getting the pancake mix ready. Pouring half the box into the bowl, what the heck? Picking the little brown pellets out of the pancake mix, I could not believe my luck. Mouse turds. There were mouse turds in my supper. Well, I was not going to go hungry, so I picked them all out and flung them into the stove. They wouldn't kill me, I hoped. Cooking up a half dozen flapjacks, I threw 2 to the dog, and the rest I spread a little PB&J on them. With a hot coffee, it made a filling meal. As long as I didn't think of the mouse crap that I was sure I could taste, that is. Looking at the bed situation, I decided to try sleeping on a mattress and use another one as a blanket. With a good fire going all night, it should keep me warm enough. I would have to be getting up every couple hours to add firewood, but if that's what it took, then, well, I guess that's what I was going to have to do. With a coffee in hand, I stood on the porch, cold breeze hitting me in the face. Looking out over the moonlit lake, I just imagined that this was what the trappers that first came to this land must have felt. A calming, almost tranquil feeling as you listen to the silence, broken occasionally by the cracking of a tree freezing or the ice moaning, but mainly just pure and complete silence. And there, to add to the moment, off from the south came the sorrowful sound of timber wolves. How could this moment get any better? Listening for a few minutes, they fell silent. I headed back inside, a smile of contentment on my face. What a night. November the 18th. On the eastern horizon, the light was just starting to turn the sky a light shade of pink. I slid from beneath the mattresses and filled the stove before jumping back into bed to wait for the cabin to warm up. 10 minutes later, I was ready for a hot cup of coffee. How a night that started so amazing could end up being so uncomfortable is beyond me. I would wake up from the shivering, fill the stove, and eventually fall back to sleep, only to be jolted awake again as the cold crept into my back. At some point during the night, I pulled the bed right up beside the stove and would just roll over and over, toasting the front, then the back. Needless to say, it was not my best night's sleep. So dawn was a welcome to me, and I could not wait to get on the trail. I decided to go and check out the river first and then eat before I headed back. So with my second cup of coffee inside me, I moved out with Lobo in tow. Once out on the lake, I noticed a dark cloud bank moving in from the west. Any serious accumulation of snow and I would have to break out the snowshoes. Straight east of the cabin, flowing in from East Amabel Lake, was the river that I was heading for. There was about 200 yards of bush before the creek opened up into a wide grassy meadow. I was flooded by the beavers. The river here was more than a 2-mile long and 100-foot wide beaver pond. No real current because of the dam holding back all the water, and I could walk right up the middle of the river without having to worry about weak ice. By the time I reached the wide open marsh surrounding the lake, I'd found 2 beaver houses. Now, turning back happy, I planned on setting them on my next trip to the area. Building a marten pole set just before the lake, I made it back to camp and got my breakfast underway. Pouring the rest of the pancake mix into the bowl for mixing, I just stared as the last bit fell out. Lucky I had a strong stomach, because there in the bowl was a dead, dried up mouse that had been in the bottom of the box. Great, some meat with my pancakes. I usually prefer sausages, but this would have to do, I guess. Pitching its tail between my fingers, I gave it a toss and picked the rest of the mouse turds out, adding some water, and dove in. If it hadn't made me sick yet, I didn't think it was going to. Throwing a couple of the flapjacks to Lobo, he wolfed them down, as did I. If a dead mouse's turds are the worst thing I eat in my life, I would be doing okay, I think. Finally fed, watered, and packed up, we moved on and down the trail. Making a mink marten set along the west shore of the lake. Turning west on my trail, I covered ground rapidly, setting a marten trap here and a mink trap there. Nothing was in my first beaver set, so I moved on to Otter Lake and passed. At Third Otter Lake, I had a nice beaver in the entrance set. Now, with the beaver in tow, I added a weasel from a mink set and a squirrel from my marten set, and picked up the beaver from the day before. Getting to where the trail turned off to Hiawatha, I dropped my load of animals and headed to the beaver sets west of the trail. With a muskrat in the dam set and a beaver in the bank set, I threw the beaver over my shoulder and trudged back to the pack and hooked up all 3 beavers in tandem. Using wire from the back legs to the nail through the nose of each beaver, they dragged fairly well through the bush. With the marten in the last trap before the lake, I noticed as I was removing the animal that the snow had started, and quite heavy, I might add. This added a new dimension to the trip. The ice roads that I had followed were not visible anymore with this fresh snow, but I didn't think it had to worry about the ice safety. But with an inch of snow on those slick trails, it made for delicate walking. With the drag from the beavers, even though it was minimal, I almost went for several spills as I was suddenly hit the slippery ice. I carried on gingerly, and just as I was about to enter the narrows, I looked off to my right, and there stood 3 moose, a cow and twin calves, staring at me from not 50 yards away. Maybe they had never seen a person dragging 3 beavers behind them before, or just never seen a person before, period. Finally back at camp, I crawled in, dragging my catch behind me. The first thing I noticed was that I had sprung a leak in the cabin roof. There was an icicle hanging from the ridgepole and a bit of a stalactite growing from the ground. Oh well, it would melt once I got the fire going, which I did right away. Hanging the animals, I put the coffee water on and sorted out my gear. Now a good meal free of mouse turds, and I took a moment to relax. Soon enough I headed outside and checked the camp set, reset the trap, and threw the flying squirrel tail away. The snow had covered any sign of what ate it, so with axe in hand I checked my fishing lines and brought a pail of water back with me. With my day finished, I laid back on the bed, listening to some music and jotting down my last 2 days' happenings. A whine at the door, and I opened it to let Lobo in, but he just stood there looking at me. In or out, dog, make a decision. Okay, I'll make it for you, and the door got shut. Kicking back, I wondered again how the guys were doing on their line so far. They should be in full swing. Sure wish for some lynx here, like I knew they had. But they had rabbits down there. Not like where a lynx would have a hard time finding a meal. Falling asleep with visions of lynx traps full of the gorgeous creatures, I didn't move again till the morning sun was clear of the trees. A battle with the wolves. November 19th. Too soon. As I lay in the bed enjoying the calm came the morning. Chain Lakes awaited me and I tried to guesstimate what my catch would be for the day. Breakfast and coffee over with, I readied another drag rope. This one, however, was for Lobo and was a little shorter than the one I used. With my pack all loaded up, I slid my boots into my snowshoe harnesses and threw the pack on my back. The night had left another 5 inches of snow and it would be a treat to make my way from now on with the shuffling gait of the snowshoe traveler. If you have never walked on snowshoes, it seems awkward at first. Most people try and lift the shoe instead of just lifting your foot, pointing your toe to the ground and sliding the snowshoe along the snow's surface. If the shoe comes up with your heel, then your harness is not set properly. I use nothing but the Bates harness as it is designed to come off if you fall through the ice. Not that that could ever happen with just a turn of your foot. The only adjustment I ever made to it was to take a 2-inch nail and hammer it into the rubber heel of my boots. When I was not snowshoeing, I pushed the nail all the way in, but when I strapped on the shoes, I pulled it out a half an inch or so. Like I said, I like my harnesses very loose, and this stopped the heel strap from falling off. Starting off, breaking the trail would be a little harder on Lobo because the trail was soft and for a bit, but after a bit it should be firmed up by the time we headed home this evening. Stepping out, I re-ran through my plans for the day as I traveled. Break the trail all the way to Lake 9, set some wolf snares, hopefully set a beaver house on number 9, and catch a pile of fur. Wondering if I had an animal at the point sets, I headed that way, and there to my amazement were 2 wolves standing on the ice staring toward the mink set. Now what? I was 100 yards from shore and my rifle. If I went back, they might be gone by the time I returned, but I had to try. I dropped the pack and did the odd-looking snowshoe run back to camp. Kicking off the shoes, I rushed into the camp, and darn it, I couldn't find the bullets for my 30-06. Where did I put those things? Finally locating them, I hurried back, and yes, I was right. They were gone. Oh well, I would have felt really stupid if I had kept going and never even tried. Still, really cool to see them, and Lobo, the ever-vigilant dog that he was, had never even known that they were there. Once at the mink set, yeah, you guessed it, the trap was sprung and the bait was gone. Sooner or later, these wolves would get their reward for stealing my bait all the time. The marten trap was empty also, so I moved on down the lake. Gosh, it felt great to be traveling the snowshoes again. The easy gait ate up the distance and was much easier on me than slogging through the snow with just my boots on. I made it to Lake 3, but not a piece of fur in my marten traps. So I pointed my shoes to the south and Lake 1 and 2. Hey Dave, how about a nice mink between 3 and 1? Sure, don't mind if I do. And it was a real nice dark male. Turning, I caught a marten in my cubby set between 1 and 2 and a beaver in the snare set. Replacing the snare and the other 2 that the beaver had totally destroyed, I also needed to replace the bait since the other beavers had eaten it all. Every bit of the bait was gone, other than an inch around each nail head. Retracing my steps to Lake 1, I added another beaver from the entrance set. Now I could start to worry about the load I was going to end up with. But a good worry, as you can only hope for these days when you catch too much fur. With a sprung trap at the marten set, I continued on past the lakes, and upon reaching 8, I'd caught just 2 squirrels and a whiskey jack in my traps. That's weird. I hoped, but it wasn't. That's weird, and I hoped it wasn't my buddies from the camp. But I knew it wasn't. These guys were all over the land, and them and their screeching cousins, the blue jays. And since the snow had arrived, with it came my little friends, the black-capped chickadees. Many a lonely day in the bush was brightened with a flock of these little guys following along with me as I traveled, always singing their song. Chickadee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee. They were so neat to have around. Again, just below the dam between 7 and 8, there was otter sign where they had been eating fish. That started to formulate a plan in my head, and that was always trouble for something. Setting mink trap at the bottom of the dam, I climbed over it and crossed to the house. My snare set produced another big beaver, but the 330 was not touched. Remembering to cut some spruce boughs to cover the hole with, I then, using a snowshoe as a shovel, piled as much snow on top as I could. This should help slow down the ice from forming and make it easier to check next time. Moving back into new country again got my imagination going. Throwing a marten set in between Lake 8 and 9, I found Lake 9 was a long, narrow lake with sheer rock shores and nothing but spruce lining the edge of the lake. From the looks of it, I didn't expect to find a live house here. And I was not surprised in that respect. At the end of the lake, I remembered that it was only about a mile from here to the Little Fraser and my trail. Trying to decide if I should just blaze the trail or set the 2 marten traps I had with me. Just blazing one out, and I covered the ground quickly, following a drainage that took me straight to the river. Making a few large blazes so I would notice them if I was coming from the other way, I turned and headed back. It was getting late, and as I picked up my fur and with my beaver in tow, I arrived at Lake 3. I hooked up the other beavers, one more on my tow line and one in my pack. Taking our time, we wound our way through the thick stand of spruce and into the more open area of poplar and jack pines. About a quarter mile or so from the lake shore, the bush thickened right up again, with a thick stand of small spruce that I could barely get through with this heavy pack. But finally the trail dropped off at the big hill that announced the presence of the lake. Half sliding on the shoes and half walking, I almost took a nosedive into the snow when the beavers slid right down onto the backs of my snowshoes. That was fun, but enough playing around. I really hoped to have something on my fishing lines because a feed of fresh fish would have done wonders for me that night. There were fresh fox tracks all along the river shore, and at one spot where the brush was very thick, I made 3 trails from the shore into one spot and hung a chunk of bait in a tree. On each of the trails I placed a fox snare, knowing that they would follow my snowshoe trail for an easy meal. This was a very simple set that I had great success with down south. It would probably work better once the snow got even deeper. Loading back up, I moved out and was on the main part of the lake when I came across a single wolf track. All right, coffee break for a sec. This was by far the biggest track I'd ever seen since I had landed and setting my hand inside the track. It was actually bigger than my hand was. He had traveled north to south on the ice, and as I backtracked him, he looked like he was coming right from my mink set. But he had stopped about 50 feet out from the set and milled around somewhat, never going in close to the traps. Following my trail back, I found where he had crossed it. The animal had left a calling card for me. Right on my trail was a big pile of wolf poop. Well, that was kind of rude. But I was the intruder in his area, I guess, and this was the best message he could send me. Back at camp, the animals hung up, and I got myself a coffee. Remembering to grab a number 4 long spring, I made my way back across the lake and set the trap right where the bait-stealing wolves kept stepping over a log near the cubby. Wiring it to the step-over log, I covered it with a light layer of dry grass and snow. That should work if they came back tonight again. Back in camp, I went about my evening rituals. Cup of coffee, supper, coffee, skinning, coffee, stretching, and finally off to bed. Oh, I forgot, one more coffee, some writing, and some music before sleep time. November the 20th. I woke to my first Northern Ontario blizzard. The wind was driving snow parallel to the ground and stinging the side of my face as I hurried to check the wolf set. Getting close, I realized that if there was one in the trap, I would have been able to see it from where I was. Maybe they hadn't come back with the storm happening. Bending down to clear some of the snow that had fallen, I noticed a piece of wire sticking up out of the snow. Pulling on it, I followed it right to the step-over log. The trap was gone. I didn't grasp what had happened for a minute, but closer inspection of the wire showed that the wolf had got caught and had chewed right through it. Are you kidding me? In 8 hours it had come, got caught, and got out. There were bite marks all the way to the end of the heavy stove wire. The wolf, now with a trap on his foot, and its partner, had gone into the bush right behind the set and had come back out on the lake about 50 yards away. At that point I lost the trail in the drifting wind-blown snow. Man, what a bummer. Not only did I lose a trap and a wolf, now that animal would suffer, and that was not really what I wanted. Boy, the strength and cunning of these animals were amazing. But for now, I would get back and get some breakfast in me before my trip down the Pody Lake trails. Bannock, oatmeal, coffee, and tang should be good to get me over the trail and back again. Cutting up the frozen beaver carcass for bait, Lobo gulped down the chunks of meat that flew off. Finally, with the shoes strapped on my feet and the pack on my back, we were on the road again. At the second trap of the day, a problem presented itself to me, in the form of a nice male marten that was so frozen that I could not get the trap off the body without taking the chance of damaging the fur. I guess I needed to carry spare traps with me, and having only 2 spare 120s, I came to realize that once my only 2 spare 120s, I came to realize that once my 220s were set, I would be out of the trap setting business for a while. I was hoping that when I brought my fur out on December 23rd, I could send it away and order more traps from the OTA's trap sales department. So dropping my pack, I hurried back to camp and grabbed the 2 spare traps along with a couple of 220s. Finally back on point, I moved down the trail and wondered to myself if there was a tree full of 120 conibears left anywhere for me. At the beaver house, the dam was now frozen solid, so I pulled the trap and put the rock and wire on the shore for next year. I never left anything on the dam because the beavers would just use it as building material. Taking the trail to Pody Lake, first I caught a flying squirrel, a red squirrel, and a marten in the 4 traps. Standing on the ice of Pody Lake, I decided that instead of backtracking, I would follow the river down to Little Pody Lake and make myself a nice circle trail. For the most part, the river was quite large and I had no need to worry about thin ice. There were but a few small fast water areas that I had to detour around. So at those spots I set the 220s for marten. I did find one beaver house, but having forgotten to throw some snares in my pocket, I left it to set for the next trip. The odd fox track, mink tracks, and tons of otter tracks were all up and down the river. The otters had their toilets at each of the open water areas, and it looked like they came back to the same place time and time again to do their business. Just after the third portage area, the river started to widen out and take a turn to the east. There I noticed a creek coming in from the south and decided to explore that in the future. But once again, I had traveled that far and not seen one marten track crossing the river in any kind of open area. It had to be that they were afraid of predators, I guessed. And I bet it was those great gray owls that they were worried about. Following the north shore of the lake, I kept watch for beaver houses without finding anything at all. 15 minutes later, I was on my trail heading north towards the camp. The first trap was the mink set where I tried to get a shot at the mink. I could see that the trap was not in place, so grabbing the wire, I was happy to see the big dark brown fur of a nice mink pop out of the snow. Next was the dam gateway set where all the otter tracks had been. I had high hopes for an otter, but I had to settle for a big beaver instead. Hooking up my drag line, I made it back to camp with some actual daylight left and just one more squirrel in the bag. This had been another good day other than, the wolf situation and the wind. Thinking about supper, I grabbed the water pail and went down to check my fish lines. The 3-pound northern that was on the end of one of the lines would make a nice couple of meals for me along with some bannock. The lake was cool looking with wave after wave of drifted snow piled up. Driven by the north wind, it had really made high drifts in the narrows. Looking neat, but it wasn't going to be much fun walking through them. Getting supper out of the way, before I started my chores, I decided to spread my traps out a bit. If I pulled one out of every 4 sets, I would have boxes and traps to expand into more area. I really needed to get more traps out to the Skookushu Lake, as the bush between there and Amabel would be a natural funnel for the marten. And after buying more traps, I could fill the spots back in with more boxes. Perfect. I would start tomorrow with my new plan. Inside for the night, I jumped on my daily chores, skinning, stretching. If I had a beaver, removing the fat from my oil lamps, and stripping some meat off the back legs for jerky. Finally, some radio time, a coffee, and a journal entry, and it was lights out. November 21st. It was the 21st, and that made 3 weeks in the bush so far. A month and 2 days till the plane would arrive for my pickup. Still loving it, but maybe by that time I would have missed talking to other people. Yeah, right. For now, however, my routine stayed the same. Check my traps, expand my area, and try to fill the fur bag. Figuring to pull the mink trap from the point and 6 other sets on the way to Amabel, I should be able to get a nice line set past the lake. Maybe even to Skookushu and East Amabel. But that would definitely mean spending 2 nights at Amabel camp. Making sure to pack a blanket to help guard against the night cold, I threw a few 220s in the pack and a bunch of beaver snares. With breakfast cooked and my last cup of coffee drained, I loaded up. Snowshoes on, pack-sack shouldered, I stepped away from the cabin. Stopping first to pull the mink set, I was surprised to see 2 wolf tracks back and the bait stolen again. One wolf was obviously dragging a trap. Now that was just an insult. And running back to the cabin, I left the dog there because I did not need him getting involved in this, and I grabbed my 30-06. I was going wolf hunting. After all, how far and fast could it run with a trap on its foot? Well, that was something I was about to find out. Following the tracks north along the lake shore, they cut into the bush about 300 yards from the point. There they took off into the bush on the east side of the lake, and only 50 feet in I came across 2 very fresh beds. They had just taken off before I got there. Now the chase was on. And on and on. Pointed in a generally east direction, I trailed them at the fastest possible speed through some terribly rough country. The wolf with the trap was always in the rear. The other one either breaking trail for it, and as the day progressed, we were pulling circles and backtracking. At one point came out on Chain Lake 7, where they ran down to the south end of the lake and back into the bush to the west again. And always old Trap Paw was behind. Was he just following the other one, or was a front wolf purposely breaking trail for him? Either way, it was amazing that for that many miles I trailed them, I never got even a glimpse of them. The hours passed by and the circles kept getting tighter and tighter until they were only 100 yards across. They stayed in the thickest bush where they could find, and finally the inevitable happened. The wolves had jumped across a 3-foot crevice in the rocks, and as I jumped over, the tail of my snowshoe was on one side and the toe on the other, and somehow it snapped. The left shoe broke right in half. This was a disappointing end to the chase, and as I limped my way back home with the day totally shot, I mused about the pain in my neck that these 2 wolves were turning out to be. But one thing did come of it. Those 2 wolves with the telltale track were never seen again that year. Knowing that I was still between Hiawatha and Chain Lakes, I headed straight west, limping along on my broken snowshoe. After a short time I came out on Hiawatha Lake just at the start of the Narrows. 6 hours later, and only 100 yards from where I had went into the bush. Grabbing my pack from where I dropped it at the point, I worked my way back to camp. I made an early supper of the leftover fish and some bannock. With no skinning to do, I took some time to care for the pelts that were in the fur bags and on the stretchers. It was a pleasure to take each fur and clean any grease or dirt, brushing it out and remembering the circumstances of many of the catches. Finally, with everything taken care of, I turned on the radio and jotted down the day's happenings. With a cup of coffee, I relaxed in bed and eventually blew out the beaver fat lamp. Dreams of wolves filled my head, and when morning rolled around, I woke up pissed off at the animals in general. To the northern boundary, November the 22nd. With my meal finished and a coffee in hand, I took down my long-distance snowshoes. These ones were 66 inches long by 14 inches wide, where the regular shoes were 48 by 14. Smaller ones are easier to maneuver through the bush, but until I had a plan on how to fix them, I would just have to use my big ones. Checking the lamp wick bindings on these shoes, because I'd prefer to change them in the warm cabin if I had to. They were fine, so I set them outside to cool down and loaded up my pack again. Down the hill I went, still grumbling about those wolves, and Lobo followed silently along behind me, sensing my mood, I guess. But it didn't last long. How could anyone stay upset on a day like today in a place like this? They had outsmarted me fair and square, and it probably would not be the last time that happened. As long as I got to win a few rounds every once in a while, life would be good. Turning north as I hit the lake, I totally ignored the point. I didn't even want to know if they'd come back last night. At the north end of the lake, I picked up my mink trap, and figuring that I could add a couple of boxes to my load, I decided to take a few from along the river, as they were not producing as good as the overland sets were. My first trap was sprung, but the second had a good marten in it. But something looked odd on the box. I thought it was a squirrel sitting there, but as I got close, out of the box popped a marten. I guess he was head down in the box chewing on the frozen bait, and it was just his tail that I saw sticking up. He flew up the tree, and with this being my first live marten encounter, I was amazed at how fast that thing could climb. No wonder they could catch squirrels in the trees. They were much faster than the little critters. Changing the trap over, the marten just watched from his perch, 30 feet over my head. I would no doubt have him in my trap on my return trip. I had brought a limited amount of bait today since I was counting on catching a beaver or two in the sets. Once I got to the Little Fraser River, I checked my otter traps and was disappointed to see otter tracks climbing from the water and going around my now frozen sets. The ice had formed where the steel and water met with the open water in front and behind the trap. Must have been the cold transferring through the steel that had started the ice forming. I would have to figure out a way to set the otter traps completely underwater, I guess. For now, I just knocked the ice off and figured out a plan for the future. I noticed a large shadow float by and looked up to see my old friend the great gray owl. He landed on the top of a broken off dead tree and all but disappeared. I didn't know if they were that smart that they knew or if it was just a fluke, but landing there he looked just like a continuation of the tree. Perfect camo. No wonder the marten didn't come out into the open at all. Adding a mink, another marten, and a squirrel to my pack, I left them hanging by a wire in a sheltered tree to be picked up on the way back. Turning left, I made my way up the trail a mile to Third Otter Lake. Again the otter trap was frozen, but my 330 was filled with a huge beaver. Hooking it up to my drag line, I returned to pick up my pack and boxes that I had left at the junction of the trails. Pointing myself east, I crossed Otter Lake and hit the Amabel Trail. My first cubby netted me a good marten, and reaching the beaver snare set, I crouched down, cleared the snow off the crystal clear ice, and swung my axe. What the heck? But it was too late. Did I really see what I thought I saw? Carefully chopping out around the edge of the ice hole, I pulled the snare pole up, and yes, it was. A big otter had got caught in the snare and almost reached the surface of the water. dying there. His face was frozen into the ice, and my first axe swing had put a deep gash in his face. Thank goodness it wasn't in his back where the price would really have dropped. Weird though, an otter and a beaver bait set. He must have just been swimming by and passed too close to the pole. Good, I'd take it. Keep going, Dave, I said to myself. You still have a long ways to go. But when I got to my crawl over log, I remembered that at that point I was only about a quarter mile from the lake. It was a little more difficult to get over the log with my long snowshoes on, but I managed with just a small ballet step and carried on. By the time I hit the lake, another marten was included, and I was thinking that this was getting to be a pretty good day. The cabin beckoned me and my stomach answered. Sure, I'll stop for a coffee and a bite to eat. Building a fire, I placed the beaver in a spot where the fur could dry before skinning. That done, I dug into my pack and pulled out my last can of stew. With my belt knife, I opened the lid of the can, and it was frozen. I emptied the contents with the help of my knife and a big spoon, and soon the thick gravy was bubbling away. With a big chunk of bannock to soak up the juice, I dove in. Blah! The veggies and potatoes had turned into a half-solid, watery mush type of food. Might be okay for someone with no teeth, but it was gross to me. But still, what choice did I have? I gulped it down without chewing anything but the meat and washed it all down with some hot coffee. Well, that was good to know. Frozen canned food was disgusting. Something to remember for the future. Filling up the stove, I headed out to set the beaver house just around the corner and take a trip up the Fraser River if I had time. Adding a marten box on the portage over to the river, I made it back to camp, having set 3 beaver, 1 mink, and a marten trap. With my trusty coffee in hand, I decided it was skinning time. Starting on the beaver, I got the skin peeled off, and after cutting the casters out, I rolled them up in the skin and to be brought back to Hiawatha, where they would be stretched and dried. The other animals were still not thawed, so I guess they could wait till the morning to get taken care of. With a little more bannock and jam as a bedtime snack, I made myself ready for another uncomfortable night of half sleep and half fill the darn wood stove. Get lost much? November the 23rd. Okay, so apparently I should have brought 2 sleeping bags into the bush with me. This whole mattress for a blanket deal would get old real fast. With the stove roaring and the water on, I jumped back into bed until it warmed up somewhat. The temperature must have dropped outside because it had sure dropped in here. I wasn't sure what the R value of 1/2 inch plywood was, but I was willing to bet it wasn't much. Not sure how I was going to be able to sleep in here when it got to 40 below, but I knew it wouldn't be much fun. I would say it was only around the 0 mark, and I was already feeling frozen when I woke up for the 5th time. But you know, nothing warms a guy up like a good walk, so after cornmeal pancakes and fried beaver meat for breakfast, I headed off for Skookushoe Lake. Passing the beaver set that I had made last night and continuing on past the river mouth where I'd seen the otter on the last trip, I turned left up the final bay and arrived at my jump-off point. It was only half a mile through the bush to Skookushoe Lake, and I'd already dialed in my compass for the trip. For that short of a trip, I didn't really need to keep a close eye on the compass, so I just checked it every once in a while as I moved through the bush. Blazing every 20 feet or so, I slowly traveled along, watching for fur sign and seeing quite a bit of marten tracks. Soon enough, I realized that I should have been at the lake by now. I'd been moving for a good hour, and even with the constant blazing, I should have hit the lake. I'd been aiming for the southeast corner of the lake, and I thought maybe I had drifted a little east of my target. Well, at this point I stopped blazing because I figured I was going to have to straighten the trail out anyway. Estimating that I must be somewhere between the lake to the west and the river to the east, I turned myself straight west on the compass and went that way. After another hour had passed, I really started questioning what I had done. Maybe I really hadn't traveled far enough north, so I turned that way. But now I wasn't sure anything. I could always just follow my tracks back, but that meant the last few hours were wasted and Then I let my stubborn side kick in. I went this way and then that way until finally I started checking the compass closely. I would take a reading and move 50 feet and take another one. The compass was pointing in a totally different direction. Great. I'd been compassing over in a magnetic anomaly in the rocks here. Now what? Sitting down and taking stock, I tried my best to figure out where I might be. Coffee time, sorry. Lobo looked at me like I would have been looking at him if he was leading this expedition. It was only an educated guess, but my instincts told me that I was west of the lake. It could not be the east side I was on because I would have been in a big circle with the lake on one side and the rivers on two other sides. My tracks would have closed the circle, and with the amount of walking I'd done, I would have hit in one of those landmarks. So the west it had to be. Turning east, I walked for what I felt was a maximum distance I needed to cover before I should have hit the lake. And then not having found it, I turned south. This was all done having put the unreliable compass away and using the sun for direction. After a 15-minute walk, I saw the bush open up and there I was, standing on the shoreline of Skookushu Lake. The northwest shore, that is. I was on the exact opposite side of the lake that I'd been aiming for. Boy, my cross-country racing coach at school would have been proud. The point was that I was there. And like I always say, I've never been lost, but I did get turned around for 2 days once. With this day better than 2/3 gone, I traveled south along the west shoreline looking for beaver houses. Nothing. Again, a lake that had all the poplar trees cut far back into the bush. I arrived at my intended access point to the lake and noticed a big lump under the snow. Could it be a beaver house? Checking, it was just a boat. What? Just a boat? The heck was a boat doing here? Looking up, I saw a blaze on a tree just inside the bush line. Oh man, you gotta be kidding me. Sure enough, there was another blaze just further in a little ways. And another, and yes, you guessed it, a whole line of them, with a 10-foot wide trail following along. Walking along, shaking my head in disbelief, I broke out onto Amabel Lake about 75 yards from where I had started the trail so many hours ago. The start of the trail was hidden by a big upturned tree. Well, that was certainly an almost waste of time. And I say almost because at least in the end I did find the trail. Might have been nice to know that it was there before I started though. Whatever, I thought to myself and stepped out onto the lake. I'll just go check my traps that I set last night and then cut some firewood. Lobo decided it was time for him to start walking on the tail end of my snowshoes, and I turned and gave him the look. He knows I hated it when he did that. He glanced sheepishly or from side to side as if to say, sorry boss, my mistake. Stopping to pull the beaver from the set, I dragged it back to camp and rebuilt the fire. I was so bummed at how the day had gone, I almost convinced myself to head back to Hiawatha in my nice warm sleeping bag. And maybe this cabin did look nicer than my dugout, but this camp had nothing on mine for staying warm. But thankfully, with only a couple hours of daylight left, common sense prevailed and I stayed put till morning. Not that I'm afraid of the dark, but it just wasn't a safe time to be traveling at this time of the year. Supper consisted of more of the same. And while relaxing over a cup of coffee, I noted that on the next trip I needed to bring coffee with me as the supply here would be gone by morning. Outside I cut a couple of trees and killed the last hour of daylight bucking it up with the saw that was hanging in the shed. Back inside, with the warmth getting to me, I daydreamed about hamburgers and french fries and a big bottle of Coke to wash it all down. I meant no disrespect to the guy who invented cornmeal. The problem was it tasted like cornmeal. Tired of wiping the drool from my chin, I loaded the stove, crawled between the blankets, and readied myself for another crappy night. This time, however, I took another mattress and stood it up behind me to hopefully add a little windbreak for my back. It seemed to help as I drifted off, only to awaken every 2 to 3 hours to fill the stove. Finally, I saw the eastern sky starting to lighten up. Thank you, Lord. It's time to go. November 24th. By the time the sun was fully over the horizon, I was a half mile down Amabel Lake and making tracks for the south. At my trailhead, I turned west and took a second to reset a sprung trap. Removing a squirrel from the next set, I kept an eye out for fresh sign along the way. Passing Otter Lake, I declined turning north to Third Otter and continued towards camp. My wolf snares were still set, so I pushed them aside for Lobo to pass and replaced them. The next trap held a marten, and I replaced the trap, moving on without wasting too much time. A little further I saw a set of tracks, and as I got closer I was surprised that it was a marten that had ventured out into the open. He walked out about 20 feet and then turned and highballed it back into the bush with his telltale two-track running formation. These traps I had set along the wide grass areas were a waste of time, and I decided to move them and concentrate my sets in the areas where the bush was right up to the river. These places I at least saw a few regular marten tracks. Sounds good, I mused to myself as I crossed the ground, my snowshoes eating up the miles. Another marten and a weasel, ermine, were added before I hit the crossover trail. Ermine, like snowshoe hares, turn white during the winter for protection when the snow is on the ground. I remembered the last winter down south when I had had a good snowfall, but then in December it had rained for several days. I was out checking traps and the poor rabbits were huddled under the spruce trees trying to stay dry. With the snow totally gone, they looked just like white targets everywhere. And after taking a couple, I just gave up. It wasn't even fair. The rest I just watched as I walked by. They thought they were so invisible. But here there was no shortage of snow, and not a rabbit to hide anyways, unless they were really good at hiding and had learned to fly, hence the lack of tracks. I didn't think this was too likely, but as I approached the trail to Hiawatha, I noticed a spot where a grouse had dove into the snow, but I could not see where it had emerged from its hole. I had encountered this before, so very slowly I moved forward. Finally I noticed a slightly darker spot of snow, and jumping suddenly on top of it, the grouse was trapped under my snowshoes. Knowing that it was going to try and move sideways, I watched it pick a spot, and as it broke from the snow, I smothered it in my arms. Grabbing it by the neck, I gave it a snap, and it was over for this bird. Cool. Supper again. The odd thing was that they normally do this on the colder nights and then are gone at daybreak. I had never seen one under the snow at this time of the day before, but oh well. His laziness was my dinner. At the trailhead, I was watching for my owl buddies, but when I noticed a black spot in the bush off to the west. Actually, there were several, and they turned out to be moose. 3 or 4 that I could tell, but they moved in and out of the tree line browsing along as I went, and so it was hard to pinpoint their numbers. I watched them until they disappeared, and I continued on my way. That started me to wondering why I had not noticed any wolf kills yet, since there was a lot of moose and more than enough wolves. I wondered what they were eating then, besides my bait, I mean. Dropping my pack, I followed in the same direction as the moose went, since my beaver trap was in that area. Arriving at the set, I chopped around the trap holes, and once loose, I gave the set a lift. Right on. Definitely something heavy in there, so I started cutting a big enough hole to get the beaver out. It wouldn't move, so I tried again, but still no good. Clearing the slush out of the hole, I knelt down and looked into the water. Ah, I see. Chop some more, try again, chop some more, and finally with a good pull, I was able to get it out, and I was the proud owner of a 6-foot poplar log. Not too sure what the fur on this thing was worth, but so I decided to practice catch and release with this one. Resetting, I turned and headed back to my pack. Lobo greeted me from his bed where he had just curled up and went to sleep. Getting up, he gave me a tail wag, but I just looked at him and said, "Yeah, whatever, dog, have a good nap." But I guess I hadn't really needed his help anyways. He never had been much good with an axe. first 2 traps toward Hiawatha were sprung, one with whiskey jack feathers in it, but the last one had a nice big marten. The animal was still partially alive, so I squeezed its heart until it expired. It took only a few seconds to finish the animal off, so I removed it and replaced the trap. Finally, I was back at Hiawatha. It seemed like I'd been gone for days. The wind had drifted snow over my trail, and it was only visible in a few places. Following along, slipping off the trail here and there, I came upon the tracks of that huge wolf again. He came out of the bush from the east and followed my trail south down the lake. He had more luck following the trail than I had been having. Walking along, I tried to count how many beaver houses I had found. Not very many compared to down south, where there was much more food and a lot less predators. Looking at the bush around here, I was sure a lumber company would do very well, but I really hoped that they would never make it this far. The wolf followed my trail right to where I turned right to go into the camp. There he fidgeted around a little, but finally went left and I went right. Happily, I climbed the trail that marked me being home, and happy I was to be there. Crawling backwards into the cabin, I dragged my pack with me. My first order of business was to get a fire going. Some birch bark, a few pieces of kindling, and a match. And voila, we had fire. And it didn't take long for the heat to begin radiating from the thin tin walls of the stove. Throwing a few bigger chunks on, I set the pail near the stove and put my coffee pot on. When the pail had loosened up a bit, I smashed the ice and left it to thaw. Waiting for the water to boil gave me time to get my catch prepared for thawing and stretching. Soon the water was boiling, and with a wonderful hot cup of this heavenly life-giving brew was ready for me. Removing pelts, stretching, and skinning kept me busy for the next few hours, taking a break long enough to have a delicious meal of grouse and bannock dipped in grouse gravy. Yum, yum. With my chores finished, I went outside to answer Mother Nature and heard a strange kind of humming coming from the south. With no wind at all, the sound carried, and weirdly enough, it sounded like a train. Could I hear a train from 20 plus miles away? I had no idea, but there was no other explanation for it. So that is what I decided it was. Boy, that sound could really carry on a cold, clear night like this. With all the miles I had put on in the last few days, I decided to stay in camp the next day. Kick back a little bit and replace my firewood pile. With the weather turning steadily colder, I was using a lot more wood. I decided to cut a bunch of green birch wood also, because it should last a lot longer than the straight dry wood. With my day all planned out, I crawled into bed, and it was so nice compared to the mattress sandwich that I'd slept on the night before. Falling asleep with a little goodnight music, I was awakened by Lobo's frantic barking. The cabin was half filled with smoke, and the wall above the stovepipe was on fire. I'd forgotten to shut the stove down, and the bark on the log had ignited. Rushing, I threw cup after cup of water until there was not a hint of a spark left. Opening the door, it took but a few minutes for the smoke to clear, and I was none the worse for wear. But hey, thanks again there, dog. Christmas is a month away, November 25th. Waking, I laid there and realized that it was just 1 month till Christmas, and that also meant 1 month minus 2 days till pickup time. Crawling from my bed to the stove, I set about getting ready for chow. With breakfast on the way, a coffee in hand, and a slow, relaxing day ahead of me, I figured life was good. Once outside, I noticed the temperature had come up, 22 degrees above zero, and the snow was starting to fall. Right behind the camp, there were 3 nice birch trees that I had been peeling for fire starter, and they were my first victims. My axe took them down in short order, and I buck-sawed them into 10-foot pieces. Even at that length, they were all a person could manage on his shoulder. With all 3 trees back at camp, I was wishing for some box horses to cut the wood on. I was getting tired of sawing from my knees. There was 2 large jack pine that were about 4 feet apart, standing beside the camp. I looked at them and thought that they might make a good set of box horses. So I cut them off about 4 feet from the ground, and with my saw I cut the tops of the stumps into V shapes that the logs could sit in and be solid. From there I would just cut a stove length off one end and then off the opposite end until the piece was only 4 feet long. The last 2 cuts would still have to be made from the ground, but it was sure easier cutting standing up this way. Happy with my invention, I retrieved more birch trees from behind the cabin and then started on a dry wood supply. On one of the trips down to the lake shore for dry wood, I decided to check the trap across the lake from the point. Cool, a nice marten was added to my catch, and I'd not even planned on catching anything today. But since I forgot to bring a trap with me, I had to make a return trip to get a Connie bear back into the box. Cut some more trees, buck them up, stop for a coffee, and some supper. With a little daylight left, I took a run behind camp to check the 2 closest marten traps. The second trap had a marten, or at least what was left of one. Wolves had been there, knocked the box from the tree, stolen the bait, and eaten all of the marten except what was between the jaws of the trap. That's it. Tomorrow there would be a number 4 long spring waiting for the return, but this time it would be anchored properly. The wolves left the set following my trail, so I followed hoping they had not repeated their dastardly deeds again. No worries. They turned off the trail well before the next trap, and a good thing because it held a female marten. Well, should I continue on or head back to camp? Camp it was, and I would check this line in the morning. Back at the cabin, I started splitting the pile of firewood that I just sawn. Just the big pieces though, and as the sun set behind the trees to the west, my firewood pile was quite impressive for just having used an axe and a buck saw. Tossing a bunch into the open doorway, I decided to spend time tonight fixing my snowshoe. I really didn't want to use my big shoes tomorrow, so I got right to work on it. The break was just back of the crossbeam, so I took 2 pieces of kindling and shaped them into the same thickness as the actual frame. Then putting a 6-inch spike on the inside, I wired the wood and nail tightly to the frame itself. With both sides done the same, I finished by wrapping the entire brace with nylon string. Hopefully this would hold and the test would come tomorrow. This project had taken a couple of hours, so now I could get at the fur that was ready to skin. The insides of the marten were still frozen, but they were just thawed enough to get the pelt off the carcass. After getting the stretching done, I was finished for the night. I mixed up a final cup of coffee, and with the radio on, I cut up on my journal entries. Finally, with the light blown out, I drifted off, traveling the trails with Chick Ferguson from the book Mink, Mary and Me, and with Jim Vanderbeck from Traplines North. November the 26th. It felt good to wake up and not have that cold breeze coming in through the door where it almost met the wall. The temperature must have risen during the night. Outside for my morning ritual, I checked the thermometer, and sure enough, it was just below the freezing point. It should be a nice day for a walk, and with the 3 or 4 inches of fresh snow from yesterday and last night, it was always great heading out on the first trip after a snow. You knew that all the tracks you've seen were going to be very fresh. I was hoping to get to the north end of Pody Lake today and maybe even up the East Creek for a ways also. With my breakfast of oatmeal and bannock finished, I strapped on my shoes and was off. The pack was loaded with all my requirements for the day, like spare traps, wire, bait, axe, snares, and oh yes, let's add that wolf trap right now. Nothing in the first 2 sets, so I cut a pole about 5 inches thick and 10 feet long to attach the trap to. Placing the trap where the wolves would have to step if they came to steal my bait again, I covered it with loose snow, placed a few guide sticks, and moved on down the trail. By the time I reached the beaver house at Little Pody, I had added a squirrel and a marten to my pack. Checking the beaver set, I pulled a small beaver out of the trap with a minimum delay. Stepping out onto the ice, I was greeted by the sight of 4 otters traveling east across the lake. They were headed for the mouth of Pody Creek, where it flowed out towards Ngogami Lake, barely a mile from where I stood. They were so cool to watch as they would run a few hops and then slide for 5 or 6 feet. I'd seen their tracks doing this many times, but I'd never witnessed it in person. So cool. Watching until they disappeared, I pointed my nose west and followed the lake shore until I hit the creek entrance. There I went into the bush to look for a spot to set a 220 conibear for marten. Cutting a 6-inch tree about 20 feet long, I wired the pole to another tree about 6 feet from the ground. I needed the small end of the pole to be about 6 feet past the second tree. Nailing a piece of bait at the very end of the pole, I then nailed a 6-inch long stick that was about an inch or so thick across the main pole, about a foot from the bait. Next I squeezed the trap onto the cross stick and wired the chain to the main pole. Covering the set completely with spruce boughs to hide the bait from birds and to form a kind of a cubby, with the only opening being through the trap, the set was complete. It was basically the same as a leaning pole set, but just with the pole parallel to the ground. A little more work than the leaning pole, but I just wanted to see which method worked better. Surveying my handiwork, I decided it looked good, but I guess the martens would be the final judge of that. Putting 2 more of these sets along the river and making a beaver snare set at the house I had found on the last trip took up a bit of my spare time. When I finally reached the trail back to Hiawatha, I figured I still had about an hour or 2 left for exploring. So cruising along the western shore, I kept watch for a live house. I noticed that on most of the lakes the beaver had a tendency to build their lodges on the west shore. Not sure why, but my thinking was that they didn't build on the dam where the waves were constantly hitting. The lake was very picturesque, with many tiny islands and with a nice rock-faced shoreline in most places. Passing several houses that I checked out for sign of life, I saw nothing alive until I hit the very end of the lake. There were fox, mink, and of course the ever-present moose tracks along the lake shore, but again, not much food for beavers. I quickly threw in a snare bait set at the house and then a marten trap in the bush a short distance behind. This side of Pokey Lake would be a whole new marten area since they wouldn't cross the lake, and I was only a half mile from the western boundary of my trap line. And I was fairly certain that no one else was trapping over there. Moving back south, I followed the east shoreline until I came to the creek that flowed in from the east. This was the creek that almost joined up with the headwaters of the Little Fraser River, and it would eventually become one of my circle trails. Putting a marten set just in the bush line, I followed the creek and found another house a half mile upstream from the lake. With a good entrance visible, I dropped a 330 in front of it and added a bait set before I hurried on my way. Again, I had pushed the day a little too long, and I would be walking back in the dark once more. Lobo seemed unconcerned since he had had all the rest he needed. Every time I stopped to make a set, he curled up and slept. But I guess he was just along to save my life when I needed him to anyways, which seemed to be more often than I liked. You would think I would have been used to this walking after dark deal, but it was just such a pain getting home and unpacking everything in the dark. I was moving a little slower than normal with the beaver dragging behind me, and with one more marten added to the pack, I finally saw the outline of the cabin, a welcoming tiny spiral of smoke still escaping from the chimney. Once supper was finished, I checked the beaver, and it was dry enough to skin. 20 minutes later, with the beaver skinned out and the marten were all still too frozen, so I stripped the fat off the beaver carcass, sliced some of the meat up for jerky into 1/4 inch strips and soaked them in salt water overnight. And in the morning they would be hung to dry over the stovepipe. Setting the frying pan full of the beaver fat on the stove, I kept an eye on it while I stretched the beaver pelt and then took care of skinning the squirrel and the marten. With all my chores done, I took the frying pan off the stove, grabbed a coffee, and stepped outside for some fresh air. It was a beautiful night, and as I sat on the woodpile sipping on my coffee, I just couldn't believe how lucky I was. A kid from down south who had dreamed of this for years, and here I was. And no matter how many times I thought about it, it just didn't seem real. Even though sometimes the daily routine would get a little humdrum, there was always the excitement of the next trap. Yeah, I was having the time of my life. Relaxing with my back against the cabin wall, I heard far off in the southern distance a lone wolf howling. Could it be that giant that I followed up Hiawatha Lake? It sounded like it was coming from Negaugamy Lake, or at least close to it. But wherever it was a perfect end to a wonderful day. Crawling back inside, I finished up my nightly rituals, radio, journal, and a coffee. I know, how did I sleep with that much coffee, right? Well, I've always said, sleep is for people who have nothing better to do.